This is going to be a serious video today because I want to speak out on the recent spate of violence against Asians in America. And you can tell I'm serious because I'm wearing my serious hair. For those of you who don't know, I am a drag queen, and underneath this is a man, specifically an Asian American man, Japanese American to be exact, and yes, one of my parents was white, so I'm technically mixed race, but I've identified as Asian all of my life and have certainly experienced racism because of how I look, which I'll talk about in a bit. But for context, there has recently been an increase of violence against Asians in the United States, culminating in the shooting of 6 Asian women in Atlanta. Hate crimes against Asians are up by 150%. According to the Asian American and Pacific Islanders Organization, there were 3,800 anti-Asian hate incidents reported, probably higher, since the pandemic started. Why during the pandemic? Here's where words matter. Our previous president and his followers insisted on calling the COVID-19 the China flu or the China virus. And this lockdown has been devastating economically, socially, psychologically. People are pissed and they want someone to blame, somewhere to vent. Some people are racist, and when they want to vent or strike out at someone and they hear China, obviously they can't do anything to China. So instead they turn to whoever or whatever they think represents China, and that means anyone who looks Asian. Doesn't matter if they're Chinese or Korean or Japanese or Filipino. There's no distinguishing. They just want to hurt some Asians. And whether that's physically or verbally or whatever, and that's where we're at. Now, I live in the Bay Area near San Francisco. Actually, I used to live in San Francisco for about 20 years. And San Francisco has, I believe, the highest Asian population of any major city on the mainland. Honolulu, of course, is higher. But in San Francisco, the Asian population is about 35%, and some project it'll go over 50% in the future. And this makes sense because Asian immigrants, at least during the last century, when they arrived on the West Coast, they went to the port cities, and San Francisco was the main one. And it is really horrible to hear about Asians in San Francisco, especially elderly Asians, being targeted for bullying and violence just for how they look. And how cowardly do you have to be to assault an elderly person, whether or not they're Asian? It's very disturbing. Now, years ago, I remember telling some younger Asian friends, don't get too comfortable. People think of us as a model minority, whatever that means, and that's another conversation. But a lot of younger Asians, I thought, didn't think that racism applied to them. That racism against Asians was something happened in the past and they didn't really see much of it. But I always said it would just take one incident, and I think I specifically said China, because that's America's biggest competitor. But one incident or big conflict with an Asian country, and things could change like that. We could get scapegoated. Because look at what happened to Muslims who got scapegoated after 9/11. It could happen to any minority, including Asians. And I knew this because I experienced it. By the way, in no way am I saying that my experience equates with anything a Black person or other people of color face, or what even other Asians face. In fact, in the scheme of things, what I experienced maybe wasn't that much. On a scale of 1 to 10, my experience of overt racism, maybe it was just a 2 or 3. So I don't want to make this sound like it was more than it was. It's just my own personal experience, which I feel compelled to share today because it's relevant and you can take it as you will. And again, compared to what other people experience, it's really nothing, but it was enough to give me perspective and empathy when it comes to racism. Now I am older and grew up in the 70s and 80s, so it was a different time, and I get that. But I remember being called a chink in not an ironic or humorous manner. In middle school, I was bullied for looking different, ironically, because since I am mixed race, people didn't know what to make of how I looked. So I got scapegoated as Middle Eastern during the Iran hostage crisis, which is really dating me, but trust me, it was a big deal. Now, my first job after high school was as a general laborer. Yeah, I know, I was a general laborer, but it happened. And it was in a small town in Maryland where my nickname was the Chinaman. Imagine working 8-hour shifts and having people yell at you, "Hey, Chinaman." And I'm not even of Chinese descent, but do you know how it made me feel? Now, here's the thing that people who haven't been on the receiving end of racism may not get. It's not the names that hurt. I mean, being called the Chinaman is kind of funny because it's so ridiculous. But what hurts is the unspoken intent behind the words. It's like they're saying, you are a different species. You're not human. You're not like the real Americans. You're something else. And it's a really weird feeling that's hard to describe. Now, I'm also gay, and I can say that homophobia feels different than racism, at least for me. I'm not saying one is worse than the other. I'm just saying it feels different to me. If I'm called a faggot or whatever, it's like I'm still human, but I'm a pervert. That somehow I made some bad choices, that if only I find the right woman, or if I find God or whatever, I could be fixed. It's different than being considered a different species, something that's not really a true human. You know, you're one of those Asians. Maybe other people of different races can weigh in, but that's just how it made me feel. And since I am a Japanese American of a certain age, I grew up with stories of the relocation camps where during World War II, Japanese Americans were rounded up and sent into camps. My mother and her 5 sisters were locked up with my grandparents in Tule Lake during World War II. My Aunt Toshiko, who's the oldest of the sisters and in her 90s and is still sharp as a whip, can recount stories from the camps, some of which have been written up in this book, The Japanese of Monterey Peninsula. I also recommend George Takei's autobiography, which I've reviewed before, To the Stars, which recounts his experience in the camps. Personally, I think we're all racist to some degree because it can't be helped. We grow up with stereotypes and images that make us prejudiced, whether we recognize it or not. And to be prejudiced is to prejudge someone, usually based on their looks, and we're inundated by the media, by society, with racial stereotypes from cradle to grave. Black men are either entertainers or athletes, or they're criminals. Latinos, especially Mexicans, are either gardeners and housekeepers, or they're lazy. Just look at a Speedy Gonzales cartoon. Asian men are math nerds, and they're neutered or non-sexual, unless they're gay. Then they're considered sexually passive by some non-Asian gays, which is a reflection of stereotypes of Asian women. Passive, subservient. And let's not forget white men. We grow up with stereotypes of them too, all over the place, more than any other. White men are the leaders, they're the bosses, they're the saviors. We all grow up with these stereotypes that get embedded in our subconscious, and it's something we all have to deal with. So when I hear someone say, I'm not racist, I think, oh, did you grow up in another dimension? Are you from Mars? Because it makes me question whether that person is aware that we are all, and I'm including myself, shaped by the culture we grow up in. I think they call it systemic racism these days. Is that what it means? Anyway, I'd much rather hear someone say, I fight against racism as much as I can, because at least I can infer that some of that means they're fighting against their own inner prejudices. By the way, things have changed since I was younger. I don't mean to imply that nothing has changed. The stereotypes that I grew up with have changed a lot. Back when I grew up, there was little positive Asian representation, except maybe Lieutenant Sulu in Star Trek and maybe some side characters in sitcoms. Margaret Cho broke the ceiling in American Girl in the 90s, which unfortunately was short-lived. But lately, there's a lot more positive Asian representation. So those who are growing up with these new role models may not have the baggage that those of us my age grew up with. And it sucks for those of you in your 20s because you have to live with the older generations whose psyches are shaped by more negative stereotypes. But hey, the generations before me were much worse, so things do change. One of my younger Asian friends on the East Coast, a woman who is highly, highly educated, we're talking multiple doctorates, who's never known overt racism, she was shook when she experienced racism during COVID. And it was just in the form of angry looks of contempt just for being Asian. And even that really shook her up. So it's happened before, it's happening now, and it could happen again. Stop the Asian hate. Just stop it.